The wind screamed across the tarmac at Camp Marshall, a relentless howl that carried the bite of early morning chill. Senator John Kennedy stepped from the sleek government helicopter, his dark suit a stark contrast against the pale dawn sky. Cameras flashed like a storm, breaking their bursts, capturing every angle of the Louisiana senator, a man whose name rang with respect among the troops for his unwavering support. In the distance, a military band struck up a solemn tune. Brass notes weaving through the air, mingling with the rustle of flags snapping in the wind. Rows of Marines stood in perfect formation, their uniforms pressed to razor-sharp precision faces etched with discipline and pride. Each man and woman awaited the senator's inspection, a rare moment to stand before a figure who'd fought for their cause in the halls of Washington. Among them was Corporal Ethan Navarro, 22, his jaw clenched tight, brown eyes fixed on a point far beyond the horizon. Unlike his comrades, whose quiet murmurs betrayed their anticipation, Ethan was a statue motionless, his expression unreadable, as if carved from the same stone as the base's memorial wall. The sun crept higher, casting long shadows across the tarmac as Senator Kennedy began his walk down the line. His stride was steady, confident, his voice low but warm as he greeted each Marine. "Fine work, soldier," he'd say, or "America's proud of you." His handshake was firm, his gaze direct, meeting each pair of eyes with a sincerity that spoke of his years advocating for the military. The line of Marines stretched across the open field, their boots polished to a mirror sheen, rifles glinting in the morning light. Ethan stood near the end, his salute crisp, his posture flawless, but inside a storm raged. His fingers twitched against the seam of his trousers, not from fear, but from a resolve that had been building for years. He'd been waiting for this moment, not for fame, not for rebellion, but for a chance to honor a promise made under a gray sky beside a folded flag in a cemetery far from here. As Kennedy drew closer, the air seemed to thicken heavy with expectation. The senator's hand extended toward Ethan, his smile steady, expecting the same brisk handshake he'd received from the others. But Ethan didn't move. His salute remained frozen, arm-rigid eyes, unblinking, locked on some distant point beyond Kennedy's shoulder. The senator's hand hung in the air a moment, stretching into an eternity that silenced the tarmac. Cameras clicked furiously, their shutters a staccato rhythm against the sudden hush. Reporters leaned forward, sensing a story unfolding. Kennedy's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. But his composure held a testament to his seasoned presence. After a breathless pause, he lowered his hand, gave a slight nod, and moved to the next Marine. The band's music stumbled for a half-beat, then pressed on. Behind the lenses, whispers erupted like wildfire. "Did you see that?" a journalist hissed, scribbling notes. "What the hell was that about?" a colonel muttered, his voice low but sharp. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears, not from fear, but from purpose. He hadn't refused the handshake to disrespect Senator Kennedy, a man he knew had stood up for troops time and again. This was about something deeper, something that had haunted him since the day he'd lost his brother, Lance Corporal Diego Navarro, in a dusty valley in Afghanistan. The official report had called it enemy fire, a clean explanation that fit neatly into paperwork. But Ethan knew the truth, carried it in a creased, worn letter tucked inside his bunk, a letter Diego had written days before his death, detailing a mistake, a cover-up, a truth buried to shield someone higher up. Ethan's refusal wasn't defiance. It was a signal, a flare shot into the sky to demand someone, anyone, notice the lie that had stolen his brother's honor. The ceremony ended, but the moment lingered like smoke. By noon, the story had exploded. Headlines blared across screens. Marine refuses. Senator Kennedy's handshake. Social media churned with fury and praise, some calling Ethan a traitor, others a hero, and a few weaving wild theories about political motives. None of them knew the truth. Not yet. In the barracks, Ethan sat on his bunk, staring at a small framed photo of Diego, his brother's grin frozen in a moment of joy. Diego had been the heart of their family, always laughing, always pulling pranks, always the first to help a stranger. Ethan could still hear his voice teasing him about his bad aim at the range, or telling stories about the kids in Afghanistan who'd followed him around asking for candy. The memory was a knife sharp and unyielding, cutting deeper with every glance at the folded flag on his shelf, the one their mother had clung to at Diego's funeral. Master Sergeant Caldwell stormed into the barracks, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. His face was granite eyes hard as he barked Navarro. "My office. Now." Ethan stood squaring his shoulders and followed his heart steady, despite the weight in his chest. The briefing room door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Caldwell leaned across his desk, his gaze drilling into Ethan. "You refused a handshake from Senator John Kennedy, a man who's gone to bat for us in Washington, in front of cameras, Marines, and the whole damn world." "Explain." His voice was a low growl, but there was a flicker of curiosity beneath the anger, a crack in his usual iron demeanor. Ethan stood tall, his voice steady despite the fire in his throat. "With respect, sir, it wasn't about Senator Kennedy. It's about my brother, Lance Corporal Diego Navarro, killed in action in Afghanistan. The report said enemy fire, but I found a letter he wrote before he died. It wasn't the enemy. It was friendly fire covered up to protect someone up the chain. I've been asking for answers for years. No one listens." His voice cracked just for a moment before he steadied it. "I hoped this would make someone notice." Caldwell's eyes narrowed, but his shoulders eased slightly. He knew Diego's name had read, the report had stood at the memorial when the base honored him. "You think this stunt will get you answers?" He asked, his tone softer now, almost searching. "I don't know, sir." Ethan admitted, his eyes meeting Caldwell's. "But I had to try. For Diego." A heavy silence settled between them. Caldwell leaned back, rubbing his jaw, his fingers tracing the lines of a face weathered by years of service. "This is bigger than you now, Navarro. You've got the world watching. Kennedy's people are already asking questions. Be ready for what's coming." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "I've been ready for years, sir." Back in the barracks, the air was thick with tension. Marines glanced at Ethan, some nodding in quiet respect, others turning away, unsure what to make of him. Corporal Harris, his bunkmate, slid onto the bench beside him, his voice low. "Press is outside, man. They're losing their minds." "You gonna talk to them?" Ethan shook his head, his fingers brushing the edge of Diego's photo. "I didn't do this for the cameras. I did it for him." He glanced at the folded flag. Its stars faded but bright in his memory. He could still see their mother, her hands trembling as she accepted it, her sobs cutting through the silence of the funeral. Diego's letter had come later, found in a footlocker among his gear, a single page that changed everything. It was a plea, a warning, a truth Diego had entrusted to paper, but never lived to share. By evening, Camp Marshall was a hive of whispers. Reporters swarmed the gates, their vans clogging the narrow road, cameras trained on the base like hawks. Ethan's phone buzzed endlessly, messages from cousins, old friends, even strangers who'd seen the news. His mother's voicemail was a knife to the heart. "Ethan, mijo, why didn't you tell me? Be careful." He didn't call back, not yet. How could he explain the weight of a promise that had kept him awake for years, the vow he'd made at Diego's grave to never let the truth stay buried? In the mess hall, Ethan sat alone, the clatter of trays, and low hum of conversation fading into a dull roar. His mind replayed the moment on the tarmac, the senator's outstretched hand, the cameras, the silence that followed. He didn't regret it, but he hadn't expected the world to notice so quickly. A young private, her braid tucked neatly under her cover, slipped into the seat across from him. "Is it true, Navarro? You did that for your brother?" Her eyes were wide, searching. Ethan knotted his throat tight. "Yeah." She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "My cousin, he died in Iraq. They never told us the whole story either. You're brave." "Not brave," Ethan said quietly, his eyes on his tray. "Just a brother." That night, as the base settled into an uneasy quiet, the distant hum of a generator, the only sound a sharp knock came at the barracks door. Lieutenant Gaines stepped inside, his face unreadable under the dim light. "Corporal Navarro, pack a bag. You're going to Washington. Senator Kennedy wants to meet you. Tomorrow." Ethan's heart skipped a jolt of adrenaline, cutting through the haze. Not a reprimand, not a court-martial, a meeting. He sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for the letter under his pillow. Diego's words, scrawled in hurried ink, felt heavier now, each line a tether to the past. This wasn't just about one moment anymore. It was about a promise, a truth, a fight that had just begun. As the helicopter lifted off the next morning, Ethan stared out at the shrinking base below the tarmac, where it all started fading into a patchwork of green and gray. He clutched Diego's letter, its edges soft from countless readings. The words were seared into his mind. "If I don't make it tell them what really happened, don't let them lie." His jaw tightened. He didn't know what awaited him in Washington, but he knew one thing: he'd keep that promise no matter the cost. The flight was a low hum, the engines a steady drone against the silence in Ethan's head. His thoughts drifted to Diego. His brother's grin, the way he'd taught Ethan to throw a spiral, the stories he'd shared about the kids in Afghanistan who'd trailed him laughing, asking for candy. Diego had been more than a Marine. He'd been a protector, a dreamer, a brother who deserved better than a lie. Ethan's refusal on the tarmac wasn't about politics or headlines. It was about making sure Diego's name wasn't forgotten, that his sacrifice wasn't buried under someone else's mistake. As the helicopter banked toward Washington, Ethan glanced at the letter one last time. The words were a weight, but also a fire. Senator Kennedy, a man known for his integrity, had taken notice. Ethan didn't know what the senator would say, what he'd do, but for the first time in years, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. The city loomed below, a sprawl of monuments and power, and Ethan steeled himself. This was for Diego. This was for the truth. The air in the barracks was thick with the weight of whispers as Ethan Navarro sat on his bunk, the hum of the base's generator, a faint pulse in the night. The news of his refusal to shake Senator John Kennedy's hand had spread like wildfire, igniting every corner of Camp Marshall and beyond. By dusk, television screens flashed with his name headlines screaming, "Marine's Defiant Act Stuns Senator Kennedy." Social media churned with a storm of opinions. Some branded him a disgrace, others a patriot, and a few spun wild tales of conspiracy. Ethan ignored it all, his eyes fixed on the creased letter in his hands, Diego's handwriting, a jagged reminder of why he'd stood still on that tarmac. The words weren't just ink. They were a promise, a plea from his brother, Lance Corporal Diego Navarro, to unearth a truth buried under layers of lies. Ethan's chest tightened, not from the chaos outside, but from the weight of carrying Diego's story alone for so long. The barracks door swung open, and Master Sergeant Caldwell's silhouette filled the frame, his boots heavy on the concrete. "Navarro," he barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the other Marines. "Briefing room. Now!" Ethan stood tucking Diego's letter into his pocket, its edges worn soft from years of handling. He followed Caldwell through the dimly lit corridors, the base alive with the low hum of activity soldiers, whispering radios crackling the distant clatter of a mess hall winding down. Ethan's heart beat steady, but his mind raced. He'd known this was coming, had braced for it, the moment he'd let Kennedy's hand hang empty. But knowing didn't make the walk any lighter. The briefing room door slammed shut, a sharp echo in the small space. Caldwell stood behind his desk, his face a mask of controlled fury, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. Curiosity, maybe, or respect. "Sit," he ordered, but Ethan remained standing, his posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back. Caldwell's gaze bored into him, unyielding. "You've got the whole damn country talking, Navarro. Refusing a handshake from Senator Kennedy, a man who's bled for the military in Washington in front of cameras brass, and your own brothers in arms. You better have a damn good reason. So talk." Ethan's throat tightened, but his voice came out clear, steady. "With respect, sir, it wasn't about Senator Kennedy. It's about my brother Lance Corporal Diego Navarro, killed in action in Afghanistan 3 years ago. The report said enemy fire, but that's a lie. I found a letter he wrote before he died. It was friendly fire, sir, covered up to protect someone higher up. I've been asking for answers, letters, calls, requests for investigation. Nothing. No one listens." He paused, his jaw tight, the memory of Diego's grin flashing in his mind. "I didn't refuse the senator's hand to disrespect him. I did it to make someone notice Diego's truth." Caldwell leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. He rubbed his temple, the lines on his face deepening. He'd known Diego had trained him, had stood at his memorial when the base lowered the flag. "You're telling me you pulled this stunt over a letter?" His tone was sharp, but there was a crack in it, a hint of understanding. "You think this is how you get justice? By making a spectacle?" "I don't know if it'll get justice, sir," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "But I know silence hasn't worked. Diego deserved better. His name deserves the truth." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the letter, its pages folded tight. This is what he wrote. He knew something was wrong, knew they'd cover it up. He asked me to make it right. Caldwell's eyes flicked to the letter, then back to Ethan. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Diego's words hanging between them. "You've got guts," Navarro Caldwell said, finally, his voice quieter now. "But you've also got a problem. This isn't just about you anymore. The senator's team called. They want answers. The media's tearing itself apart out there, and the brass is breathing down my neck. You've started something, and it's not going away." Ethan nodded, his fingers tightening around the letter. "I understand, sir. I'm ready to face whatever comes." Caldwell studied him, his expression unreadable. "You better be. Get some rest. You're not done yet." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting, but as Ethan turned to leave, Caldwell added, "Navarro, I knew your brother. He was a good Marine. If what you're saying is true, I hope you get your answers." Back in the barracks, the other Marines were quieter now, their glances a mix of awe and uncertainty. Corporal Harris, Ethan's bunkmate, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Man, you really stirred the pot," he said, his voice low, but not unkind. "They're saying you're either a hero or a fool. Which one is it?" Ethan sat on his bunk, pulling out Diego's photo, the one where his brother was laughing, his arm slung around Ethan's shoulders. "Neither," he said softly. I'm just a brother, keeping a promise." Harris didn't push, just nodded and turned away, leaving Ethan with his thoughts. The photo felt heavier than it should. Diego's smile a reminder of everything lost. Ethan could still hear his brother's voice telling stories about the kids in Afghanistan, about the time he'd given his last MRE to a hungry boy in a village. Diego had been the kind of Marine who made people believe in something bigger. And then he was gone, reduced to a report that lied about his final moments. By morning, the base was a pressure cooker. Reporters had doubled outside the gates, their cameras trained on every exit, waiting for a glimpse of Ethan. His phone buzzed with messages, family, friends, strangers, even a text from his cousin in Texas. "Saw you on the news. You okay?" Ethan didn't reply. He wasn't ready to explain, not when the truth was still buried, not when Diego's name was still tied to a lie. In the mess hall, conversations hushed as he walked in, Marines glancing over their trays. A few nodded a silent show of support, but others turned away, their whispers sharp with judgment. At Oro 900, Lieutenant Gaines appeared, his face taut. "Navarro, you're wanted in the CO's office. Now." Ethan followed, his boots echoing in the corridor, each step heavier than the last. The commanding officer, Colonel Reynolds, sat behind a polished desk, his eyes sharp but not hostile. "Corporal Navarro," he began. His voice measured, "Your actions yesterday have caused a hell of a storm." Senator Kennedy's office reached out. "He wants to meet you. In person. Washington, tomorrow." Ethan's breath caught, but he kept his face steady. "A meeting, sir, not a reprimand." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Not yet. The senator's curious. He's not the kind of man to let something like this slide without understanding it." "You've got his attention, Navarro. That's not a small thing." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "But let me be clear, you're walking a tightrope. Whatever you're chasing, you better be damn sure it's worth it." "It is, sir." Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "It's for my brother." Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Pack your bag. You're on a flight at 0600. And Navarro, don't screw this up." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ethan moved through his duties on autopilot, his mind fixed on the letter in his pocket. He could recite every word by heart. "Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone. It wasn't the enemy. It was us. They'll try to hide it. Don't let them." Diego had written it in a hurry, the ink smudged in places, as if he'd known his time was short. Ethan had found it months after the funeral, tucked in a book Diego had left behind. The words had changed everything, turned grief into a mission, silence into a fight. That night, Ethan sat alone in the barracks, the other Marines giving him space. He pulled out Diego's photo again, tracing the edges with his thumb. Memories flooded in Diego, teaching him to drive the two of them sneaking beers behind their mother's house. Diego's voice promising he'd be back from Afghanistan in time for Christmas. Then, the call, the knock on the door, the flag in their mother's hands. Ethan's chest ached, but he pushed it down, focusing on the letter. This meeting with Kennedy wasn't just a chance, it was a door, one he'd forced open with a single silent refusal. At dawn, Ethan boarded the helicopter, the roar of the blades drowning out the chaos in his head. He clutched Diego's letter, its weight grounding him as the base shrank below. Washington loomed ahead, a city of power and secrets, and Ethan didn't know what to expect. Senator Kennedy was a man who'd built his career on standing up for what was right, a man who'd fought for veterans and their families, but would he listen? Would he care about one Marine's truth, one brother's promise? Ethan didn't know, but as the helicopter cut through the morning sky, he felt the fire in his chest burn brighter. This was for Diego. This was for the truth. The helicopter's blades sliced through the morning air as it descended toward Washington, the city's monuments glinting like beacons below. Ethan Navarro sat rigid, his fingers wrapped around Diego's letter, its creased edges a lifeline to his purpose. The hum of the engines couldn't drown out the pulse in his ears, each beat a reminder of why he was here. He wasn't just a Marine anymore. He was a brother carrying a truth too heavy to bury. Senator John Kennedy, a man known for his fierce loyalty to the troops, had summoned him not for punishment, but for answers. Ethan's refusal to shake the senator's hand on the tarmac at Camp Marshall had sparked a firestorm, and now, in the heart of the nation's capital, he was about to face the man whose outstretched hand he'd left empty. The weight of that moment pressed against his chest, but so did a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Kennedy would listen. The helicopter touched down, and Ethan was ushered into a sleek government SUV, the city blurring past as they sped toward Capitol Hill. The driver, a stone-faced staff sergeant, said nothing, but Ethan caught the man's glance in the rearview mirror. Curiosity, maybe respect. Ethan's uniform was crisp, his boots polished, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying Diego's letter. It wasn't the enemy. It was us. Don't let them lie. The words had driven him to this point, to a meeting that could either bury his brother's truth deeper or finally bring it to light. He straightened his cover, squared his shoulders, and stepped out into the shadow of the Capitol, where a staffer in a sharp suit waited to escort him inside. The senator's office was a blend of old wood and modern power mahogany shelves lined with books, a flag in the corner, and a window framing the Washington Monument. Ethan stood at attention as Senator Kennedy rose from behind his desk, his presence commanding but warm, his eyes sharp with the intensity of a man who'd spent years cutting through Washington's noise. Corporal Navarro Kennedy said, his voice carrying the drawl of Louisiana, "You've got a lot of people talking. Sit down. Let's hear it." He gestured to a chair, but Ethan remained standing, his hand instinctively brushing the letter in his pocket. "With respect, sir." Ethan began, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. "I didn't refuse your handshake to disrespect you. It was about my brother Lance Corporal Diego Navarro, killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago. The report said enemy fire, but that's not true. I have his letter." He pulled it out, the pages trembling slightly as he handed them to Kennedy. "He wrote it before he died. It was friendly fire, sir, covered up to protect someone higher up. I've been trying to get answers. Letters, calls, requests. Nothing. I hoped my action would make someone notice." Kennedy took the letter, his eyes scanning the scrawled words. The room was silent save for the faint tick of a clock on the wall. Ethan watched the senator's face, searching for a reaction. But Kennedy's expression was unreadable, his focus entirely on Diego's words. When he finished, he set the letter down, his gaze meeting Ethan's. "This was hidden," he said, not a question but a statement, his voice low with a weight Ethan couldn't quite place. "You're saying the report was falsified to cover a mistake?" "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, his jaw tight. "Diego died saving a civilian caught in the crossfire. Our own unit's fire. They buried the truth to protect a lieutenant colonel. My family, my mother, me, we've been asking for years. No one would listen." Kennedy leaned back, his fingers steepled his eyes, never leaving Ethan. "And you thought refusing my handshake would get my attention." Ethan swallowed hard. "I hoped it would, sir. I didn't know what else to do." A long pause stretched between them, the air heavy with the gravity of Diego's story. Then Kennedy nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "You were right," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm listening now." He stood walking to the window, his back to Ethan for a moment. I've spent my career fighting for men and women like you and your brother. If what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, we're going to make this right. Quietly, but thoroughly. Ethan's breath caught a mix of relief and disbelief flooding his chest. Thank you, sir. He managed his voice barely above a whisper. Kennedy turned his eyes sharp but warm. Don't thank me yet, Corporal. This is just the start. He picked up the phone, his voice crisp as he spoke to an aide. Get me General Hargrove and the Inspector General's office. We're opening an investigation into Incident 46B Afghanistan 3 years ago. I want answers, and I want them fast. The meeting ended, but Ethan's mind was spinning as he was escorted out. Kennedy's words echoed in his head. We're going to make this right. He'd expected pushback, maybe dismissal, but not this. A senator taking his side, moving with the kind of decisiveness Ethan had only heard about in stories. Back in the SUV, he clutched Diego's letter, its weight lighter now as if sharing it had lifted some of the burden. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Days later, back at Camp Marshall, word came through the chain of command. A special task force had been formed, led by investigators handpicked by Kennedy's office. Ethan was called to brief them, sitting in a sterile conference room as he recounted every detail Diego's letter, the official report, the inconsistencies he'd pieced together over years of digging. The investigators listened, their faces grim, taking notes, as Ethan spoke of the civilian Diego had died, saving the misfire that had taken his life. The lieutenant colonel, whose name kept surfacing in whispers but never on paper. Weeks passed, each day a blur of anticipation and dread. Ethan returned to his duties, but the base felt different now. Marines who'd once avoided him now nodded in respect. Others still kept their distance, unsure what to make of the man who'd taken on the system. In the mess hall, Corporal Harris slid into the seat across from him, a rare grin on his face. Heard Kennedy's got the Pentagon scrambling. You really shook things up, Navarro. Ethan shook his head, pushing his tray aside. It's not about me, it's about Diego. Harris leaned closer, his voice low. Yeah, but you made it happen. That's something. Then one morning, the news broke. Ethan was in the barracks, lacing his boots, when Lieutenant Gaines burst in his face, a mix of urgency and triumph. Navarro, get to the CO's office. Now. Ethan followed, his heart pounding, and found Colonel Reynolds waiting with a rare smile. It's done, Reynolds said, handing Ethan a report stamped with the Inspector General's seal. Incident 46B has been reclassified. Friendly fire caused by a miscommunication under Lieutenant Colonel Brenner's command. The cover-up's been exposed. Your brother's name is clear. Ethan took the report, his hands trembling as he read the words. Lance Corporal Diego Navarro died heroically while shielding a civilian from friendly fire. The truth at last, in black and white. He looked up, his voice thick. What happens now, sir? Reynolds leaned back. Brenner's facing charges. The report's going public. And Senator Kennedy wants to make a statement. He's asked for you to be there. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. That evening, he stood in the background as Kennedy addressed a small press conference, his voice steady and resolute. Lance Corporal Diego Navarro was a hero failed by a system meant to honor him. Kennedy set his eyes, scanning the crowd. His brother, Corporal Ethan Navarro, stood tall to bring us the truth. This isn't just about one Marine. It's about every soldier who deserves honesty, who deserves justice. The cameras flashed, but Ethan barely noticed, his eyes fixed on the folded flag he'd brought from his bunk, Diego's flag. Back at the base, Ethan was called to the parade ground. Colonel Reynolds stood before the assembled Marines, his voice carrying across the ranks. Corporal Navarro stepped forward. Ethan did, his heart pounding as Reynolds pinned a new rank to his uniform. Sergeant Navarro Reynolds said, his voice firm, "For your courage on and off the battlefield." The Marines applauded, but Ethan's eyes were on the flag in his hands. "This isn't for me," he said later to Harris, his voice quiet. "It's for Diego." That night, Ethan sat alone, the report and Diego's letter side by side on his bunk. The truth was out, but the ache in his chest remained. He thought of their mother, of the call he'd make tomorrow, of the words he'd say. "They know now, Mama. They know what Diego did." He thought of Diego's laugh, his stories, the way he'd always put others first. The truth hadn't brought him back, but it had given him honor. And, for now, that was enough. The first light of dawn crept through the barracks window, painting faint stripes across Ethan Navarro's bunk. He sat in silence, Diego's folded flag cradled in his hands, its stars faded but sharp against the worn fabric. The weight of the past months had settled into something solid, not the crushing grief of before, but a steady resolve, like the foundation of a monument. The truth about his brother, Lance Corporal Diego Navarro, was no longer buried. Diego had died a hero, shielding a civilian from friendly fire in a dusty Afghan valley, and thanks to Ethan's refusal to shake Senator John Kennedy's hand, the lie that had hidden his sacrifice was exposed. Senator Kennedy, a man whose dedication to the troops was unquestioned, had taken up Ethan's cause, ensuring the truth saw light. Now Ethan was more than a Marine. He was a catalyst, though he'd never sought the spotlight. The headlines had faded, but the impact of his stand rippled outward, touching lives he'd never imagined. This wasn't the end of Diego's story, it was the birth of a legacy. Camp Marshall buzzed with a new energy. Marines who once cast sidelong glances at Ethan now met his eyes with quiet respect, their hands grazing his shoulder in passing. In the mess hall, conversations hushed when he entered, not out of fear, but awe. A young private, her braid tucked neatly under her cover, approached one evening, her voice low. "Sergeant Navarro, my uncle was lost in Fallujah. The report never added up. What you did for your brother, it's making me think we should dig deeper." Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady, the weight of her words echoing his own. "Keep asking," he said. "The truth doesn't come easy, but it's worth it." She nodded, a spark of determination in her eyes, the same fire Ethan had felt when he'd first read Diego's letter. That spark became a flame. Ethan founded Justice's Salute, a small but fierce organization to help military families uncover truths lost to error or intent. He poured his savings into a website and a hotline manned by volunteers, Marines like Corporal Harris, veterans with their own scars, and civilians moved by Diego's story. The first call came from a mother in Georgia, her voice breaking as she spoke of her daughter, a sailor killed in a training accident, the details vague and incomplete. Ethan listened, jotting notes, promising to follow up. Within weeks, Justice's Salute was handling 8 cases each, a family seeking closure, each a name waiting to be honored. Ethan worked late into the nights, sifting through reports, calling contacts, learning the slow grind of bureaucracy. But every email, every call, felt like a step toward the world Diego had believed in, one where no sacrifice was forgotten. Senator Kennedy, true to his character, supported Ethan quietly but powerfully. He connected Ethan with Pentagon investigators and legal advisors, ensuring Justice's Salute had the tools to challenge the system. At a ceremony on base, Kennedy returned to Camp Marshall to dedicate a new plaque on the memorial wall. Diego's name gleamed in the stone alongside others whose stories had been righted by the task force Kennedy had championed. The senator's voice carried over the gathered Marines, steady and clear. These men and women gave their all. We owe them the truth, not just for them, but for every family waiting for answers. Sergeant Navarro showed us what courage looks like. Ethan stood in the back, Diego's flag under his arm, his throat tight. He didn't want praise, but Kennedy's words felt like a nod to Diego, a promise kept. The task force born from Ethan's stand uncovered 9 more misreported incidents over the next year. Ethan made it his mission to contact each family, delivering news that was both painful and healing. A widow in Texas wept over the phone, thanking him for proving her husband hadn't died in vain. A father in Oregon, his voice rough, said, "You gave my son's honor back." Ethan didn't feel like a hero, only a brother who'd done what was right. But each name restored each family, given closure, was a piece of Diego's legacy, a testament to a Marine who'd always put others first. At a national memorial in Arlington, a new section of the wall was unveiled, dedicated to those whose truths had been reclaimed. Diego's name was there, carved deep, a permanent mark of his sacrifice. Ethan stood before it, his uniform crisp, his sergeant's stripes catching the sunlight. He saluted slow and deliberate, whispering, "They know now, Diego. They know." His mother stood beside him, her hand trembling as she touched the stone. "They said his name, right?" she whispered, tears streaking her face. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, the flag pressed between them, a silent vow fulfilled. Months later, at a fundraiser for Justice's Salute, Senator Kennedy appeared, his presence drawing the crowd's eyes. Ethan stood across the room watching as the senator spoke of accountability, of honor, of the debt owed to those who serve. When their eyes met, Ethan stepped forward, extending his hand. Kennedy took it, his grip firm, his smile warm with mutual respect. The crowd watched, but the moment was theirs alone, a silent acknowledgement of a shared fight. No words were needed. The handshake said it all. The lesson was simple but profound. One voice raised against silence can shift the world. Ethan's refusal hadn't been about defiance. It was about love, about a brother's promise to honor a hero's truth. Justice's Salute grew, training recruits to question vague reports, teaching families to demand answers, showing a nation that every name deserved its story. Ethan's stand had been a single act, but it taught those who heard it that courage isn't always loud. It's persistent. It's honest. It's a refusal to let the truth stay buried. For young Marines, for grieving families, for anyone who'd ever felt unheard, Ethan's story was a call: speak, fight, endure. Truth isn't just a gift. It's a duty. At dawn, Ethan stood alone at the Arlington Wall, the air cool and still. He saluted Diego's name, his hand steady, his heart full. "This one's for you," he whispered. The wind carried his words, soft but sure, into the morning. Some stories end in noise, but Ethan's ended in truth. A brother's promise kept a legacy that would echo for generations.